Imagine the Forum late in the reign of Nero, vendors calling over piles of figs, the bronze of statues warming in the sun, senators gliding by in bands of purple. A hush falls, not because Rome is short of noise, but because the emperor is crossing the square with a veiled bride. The veil is costly, the jewels glitter, the gestures are rehearsed, yet the face beneath does not match the story being performed. Whispers pull like a current through the crowd. People pretend not to look. Those who do glance quickly away. Everyone understands the danger of seeing too much. Rome is watching a ceremony with the trappings of love and the scaffolding of fear. To grasp how Rome reaches this moment, you have to begin years earlier, when Nero was a boy-made ruler. At roughly 16, he stepped onto a stage shaped by other men, his tutor Seneca, the Praetorian prefect Burrus, the careful power broker Agrippina. The first acts were reassuring. Tax relief here, spectacles there, a wide smile for the plebs, poetry and music to soften the edges of command. An emperor who sings seems, for a while, less likely to kill. But no throne in Rome stays gentle for long. Court life breeds competition. Favors must be granted, then repaid with interest. Fear settles in the corners of every gilded room. As Nero grew into his power, he also grew out of those early restraints. Advisors died or were dismissed. Critics were silenced. The circle around him narrowed until it functioned as a mirror. Absolute power is not only the ability to command, it is the curse of always being right because no one is allowed to say otherwise. Enter Poppaea Sabina, whose presence turned the palace's games into a private religion. She was dazzling. Yes, beauty is mentioned in every old account, but more important was her intelligence and instinct for risk. Nero, already married to Octavia by political arrangement, drifted toward Poppaea first as a lover, then as a cause. Lavish gifts followed. So did new enemies. Octavia was put aside, then eliminated. Rome, tutored for generations in how to read imperial theatrics, understood what this signaled. To love an emperor's love is to gamble with your life. The obsession did not stop at marriage. It grew. Nero curated Poppaea's image until the imperial city itself seemed to be a gallery devoted to her. Portraits on walls, sculpted profiles in the gardens, a chair at banquets that told everyone whose favor carried the room. But obsession is not devotion. It is a hunger that becomes angry when it is not constantly fed. The old writers tell us that Nero guarded Poppaea's movements, rationed her company, measured the gaze of other men. They also disagree sometimes sharply about the final argument. One tradition says he struck her while she was pregnant and that the blow killed her. Another suggests rough handling during a quarrel. Others hedge or hint at complications without naming a single cause. The point is not to choose a version simply because it satisfies. The point is to notice what every version agrees on. She died. And with her died a fragile claim Nero made about himself that power would make him whole. What does a court do when the sun it orbits goes black? It keeps moving. Poppaea's death sent shockwaves through the palace. Not only because a woman had died, but because grief, in the hands of a man who cannot be contradicted, is a tool. The funeral did not release the court from its duties. It produced new ones. Honors multiplied. Cultic gestures that once crowned emperors in death were bent toward a consort. Embalming and elaborate rites gave sorrow an architecture. A chair was left empty at feasts. The room learned to speak of her in the present tense. When a sovereign decides that a fiction will be the truth, he does not insist on believing it alone. He forces everyone else to clap. Here, a composite witness helps us feel the air moving in those rooms. Picture an older seamstress from the wardrobe quarters, call her Marcia, who has served 3 reigns and knows how a day can turn simply because a rumor turns. When Poppaea dies, Marcia is summoned to the women's apartments, not to pack the silks away but to repair them as if their owner might wear them tomorrow. She carries veils to be steamed, clasps to be polished, shawls to be mended where the gold thread has frayed. The message is plain. Grief must look like presence. In the hall beyond, an official speaks the empress's name in the present tense and is praised for his tact. Another tries was and is sent home to think about loyalty far from Rome. Marcia's hands remember the shape of Poppaea's shoulders. Her eyes remember the weight of that famous hair. She cannot help noticing the way the palace keeps arranging objects to summon the dead bracelets on a stand, sandal straps laid in perfect loops, a silver mirror placed face up on a table so it can catch and hold a face that will never lean toward it again. The living move through a museum of a single person, and the emperor moves among them like a curator who is also a supplicant, trying to persuade the exhibits to comfort him. This is where grief often slides into magic, when we ask objects to do what people cannot. Nero begins to treat Rome as a stage on which reality can be reordered. If the proper rites are performed and enough images are made, perhaps the boundary between gone and present can be blurred. This is theatre as policy. But theatre requires a cast, not just props. If Poppaea cannot be there, someone must be there as Poppaea. It is at this hinge that Sporus enters the record, a youth from the imperial household, likely a freedman, trained for service in a world where gratitude to the emperor is not simply polite, it is the law of your survival. Freedmen in the palace could rise to surprising influence, but their status came wrapped in conditions. The benefaction that lifted them also marked them. A favor can be revoked, a life can be rearranged. For such men, identity is partly a license, stamped by a master's mood. The stories say Sporus resembled Poppaea, and it is not hard to see why that detail mattered. Romans read the body as sign. Resemblance could mean kinship, omen, the touch of a god. In a mind already cracking under grief and guilt, likeness could look like permission. It could look like a way to resurrect what had been broken and to excuse the breaking. Imagine Marcia again, months after the funeral, summoned this time not to the women's quarters, but to a smaller suite near the emperor's own rooms. A young attendant waits there, uncertain in posture, but careful with his words. He is dressed plainly, yet something about the angle of his cheek, the long line of his eyelids, triggers a sensation she cannot place until she sees, on a nearby table, an ivory cameo of Poppaea. The young man's gaze flickers to the cameo, then away. He has been told to stand still while tailors take measurements. He has not been told why. In a palace, reasons are often more dangerous than orders. The seamstress measures in silence. She notes sizes, marks patterns, instructs assistants to fetch fabrics that had once been reserved for a single woman. As her needle slips in and out of cloth, she feels the way a story is beginning to close over a living person. That is what power does at its worst. It writes a part and then traps a breathing body in its lines. By the time the fittings end, Rome is already preparing to applaud a solution it does not dare name. The emperor has found a way to keep a chair filled, a title spoken, a gaze available to be possessed. He will not say he is building a ghost out of silk and command. He will say he is healing. But Nero's mourning didn't end with a funeral. It rewrote reality. Rome normally burned its dead. Fire purified, freed the breath, and made space in a crowded city where memory could be kept in ash and inscription. What happened for Poppaea Sabina bent that grammar. Ancient writers say Nero refused cremation, ordering her body embalmed with rich aromatics and laid in a splendid tomb, gestures that echoed Eastern rites more than Roman custom. Whether the burial was in Rome's grand precincts or a private mausoleum, the signal was unmistakable. This would not be a passing, it would be a presence. Follow the sense to understand it. In a workshop near the Palatine, a perfumer called him Felix heats oil in a bronze pan until it shivers. He adds ground myrrh, then cassia and cinnamon, stirring with a reed as the mixture darkens. Spice merchants have grown bold since the order came. The palace is buying by the amphora. Felix has supplied noble houses for years, but nothing like this. Assistants fan the coals, carry sealed jars to the storerooms, return with lists written in a tidy hand. More nard, more balm, more aloes. Death, he thinks, has become a patron. Felix has never seen the corpse, but he sees what the city is being asked to inhale. Processions roll by with censers. The smoke does not drift, it insists. Inscriptions bloom using the honorifics of divinity. Musicians rehearse a hymn carrying her name. The court perfects a choreography that makes grief look endless. An empty seat at banquet. A toast to the empress in the present tense. The careful placement of portraits so no corridor forgets. When a fiction is enthroned, ritual must keep it fed. The more elaborate the rite, the easier the illusion that the wound has closed. Apotheosis, turning the dead into the divine, was not unheard of in Rome's high politics. Emperors could become gods. Monuments made the ascent plausible. Extending that radiance to a consort was bolder, and the choice said as much about Nero as it did about Poppaea. He needed an answer to the accusation that his violence had destroyed the thing he loved. Deification offered a counterspell. If the beloved becomes a goddess, then grief can dress like reverence rather than guilt. The court understood the exchange rate. Honors paid the price of safety. This is the background against which a boy's face becomes dangerous. Sporus enters the imperial horizon as a minor figure in a major machine, likely born enslaved within the palace or attached to it, then manumitted young. Such youths learned letters, accounts, and service protocols. They were taught when to speak and when to be heir. To be a freedman of the emperor was to live under a special sun. The light raised you. It also pinned you in place. Gratitude, in this world, was not a feeling. It was a contract with teeth. Roman society named these bonds plainly. A freedman, libertus, owed duties, operae, officium, to the former master, now patron. In the imperial household, that patron was not a man among men, but the axis around which law itself seemed to turn. Freedmen could run offices, correspondence, ab epistulus, finances, a rationibus, petitions, a libellus. They could own property, commission, art, even patronize others. But the ladder leaned on one wall only. Favor, lose it, and the rungs vanish. Resist, and the wall falls on you. The sources agree on a single uncanny detail. Sporus resembled Poppaea. Eyes, cheekbones, a certain softness of line enough to make courtiers glance twice and then away. In a culture trained to read bodies as texts, likeness was never neutral. Roman portraiture prized recognizability. Family statues in atriums taught generations to find kinship in bone. Philosophers and quacks alike trafficked in physiognomy, the idea that character and destiny show themselves on the face. Add grief and guilt to that habit of reading, and resemblance becomes an omen. Permission to pretend that what is gone is not gone. We can return to Felix to feel how quickly a resemblance becomes a policy. The perfumer has been summoned to a quiet wing. A chamberlain wants to know which oils best soften skin for prolonged wear of cosmetics. Felix, wise enough never to ask why, lists blends and quantities, suggests cold-pressed olive with a touch of beeswax for adhesion, mentions that lamp-black coal smudges in summer unless cut with a resin. He writes down recipes, signs them with a careful hand, and only when he leaves does he register the absurdity. He has just prescribed a regimen fit for an empress, yet the chamber was guarded by men from the emperor's personal detail, not the household of a living woman. Meanwhile, somewhere between those guarded doors, Sporus is being measured. Tailors circle with chalk and string. A hairdresser fingers curls and speaks in the professional dialect of angles and lengths. A tutor of deportment demonstrates how to sit so that fabric falls in clean lines, how to step so a hem obeys without tangling, how to lower the gaze without losing sight of the room. None of these acts are violent on their own. Together, they begin to erase. The lesson is not, hold your hands like this. The lesson is, you will make other people's memory feel true. What protects a person from such a lesson? Rank can. Sporus has little. Law can. Here, law wears the emperor's face. Community can, but in a palace, community is a set of overlapping performances each calibrated for survival. There are decent people inside these walls, and some are surely thinking, in private, that a line is being crossed. But the court has been trained, by rewards and punishments, to treat lines as suggestions. If the sovereign insists that a chair has an owner, the question is not whether that is true. The question is, who dares to say no? Sporus is not chosen because he is weak of mind or incompetent at duty. He is chosen because he looks like a solution to a problem that should have no solution. The role he is being fitted for comes with silks and jewels and rooms furnished by tribute from distant provinces. It also comes with the annihilation of his own name. In the lists, he will be Sabina. In the emperor's mouth, he will be Poppaea. He will be expected to remember a life he did not live, and to consent to the theft of his own. Felix hears, weeks later, that his oils are working. The phrase chills him. He finds himself watching faces in the street the way the court has been watching one face in the palace, testing for resemblance, as if resemblance were a spell that might at any moment be said over him. He goes home earlier than usual, tells his wife they will take a small loss and cancel one order to a senator's household. He lies awake listening to the city breathe, thinking about how scent can make the dead seem near, and how sometimes the effort to bring the dead close drags the living under. By now the court whisper has hardened into expectation. There will be a ceremony. There will be a name. There will be an arrangement in which the shame of a crime is repainted as fidelity so pure it conquers nature itself. The final piece is the body, its capacity to be coerced into serving a fiction. For that, the emperor will not rely on oils or fabrics. He will summon physicians and surgeons and give them an order that has nothing to do with healing. The summons goes out at dusk, when the palace grows quiet enough to hear sandals on polished stone. Not to the women's apartments this time, not to the perfumers or the tailors, but to the rooms where metal is boiled and linen is rolled, and men who know where veins lie try not to think about hands that shake. The emperor wants physicians, he wants surgeons, he wants a miracle that looks like healing and is in truth obedience. Roman medicine could be brilliant in theory and brutal in practice. The books of Celsus and others describe instruments with crisp names: scalpels, forceps, hooks, cautery irons, and procedures done with matter-of-fact economy. Pain relief was a blend of pragmatism and prayer. Wine until the world blurred, poppy or mandrake to pull the mind under, sometimes a compress of cold, sometimes just the promise that it would be over soon. Infection was the spectre no one could see but everyone feared. Linen bandages were boiled, bronze was passed through flame, wounds were washed with vinegar and honey. Still, fever had a way of finding its chance. In this world, a surgeon, call him Gaius, has learned to treat spear cuts and broken fingers from hammer falls, to set dislocated shoulders, to lance abscesses that turn men from themselves. He knows what can be mended and what can only be endured. He also knows the law. At various times in Rome's history, cutting a boy to unman him was condemned, punished, chased out of Italy, even while eunuchs arrived from elsewhere and served in houses that could afford them. Like so many rules that stand in a hard wind, enforcement bent with power. There is, however, a law more immediate than statute, the emperor's will, spoken in the cool voice of a chamberlain. Gaius hears it now. He does not misunderstand. Sporus is brought into a room arranged to look medicinal rather than punitive. Bowls are set out, towels are folded. A brazier keeps instruments hot. The care is real. The physician has no reason to want a patient to die, but the purpose is a wound with a story attached. Servants move quickly, not out of kindness, but from long practice at anticipating the needs of men who cannot be kept waiting. Oil is warmed, a cup of thickened wine appears, then another, and a draught that smells faintly of earth and night. Sporus drinks because he is told to drink. Someone speaks to him in a low voice about breathing. Someone takes his pulse with a thumb. Someone else checks the braids of linen meant for binding. You could narrate the next minutes in clinical terms. They would be true enough, and they would miss the point. What matters is not only the cut, but the intention of the cut, to reshape a body so that a fiction can be lived. The surgeons work with practiced motions because hesitation is dangerous to the patient, yes, but more immediately to themselves. The air is thick with oil and metal. When they are done, the cautery hisses, and the room smells different, the way rooms smell after the moment that cannot be taken back. Gaius stays until Sporus sleeps. He checks the bindings, asks for more boiled water, signs a slate for medicines to be brought and changed on schedule. He leaves orders for poultices and for honey salves. The old texts praise honey for how it fights rot and soothes pain. He instructs that the room be kept warm, that flies be kept away, that no visitor touch the dressings without clean hands. It is good medicine within the limits of the time. It is also the completion of a sentence long in the writing. Recovery is its own school. Fever may come. If it does not, it is counted as a gift, though no one says the word out loud. Days blur into lists. Drink, eat, change, clean, sleep, wake, measure. The household's best nurses, a rank in truth, if not in title, develop a new rhythm for the room. They turn Sporus gently. They watch for swelling at the wrong times and the wrong places. They measure his breaths the way a scribe measures columns of figures. They speak to him in the voice reserved for precarious things, soft, as if loudness might tip the balance. When the body quiets, the second operation begins, the one without knives. Tutors arrive, not philosophers or poets, but artisans of appearance. A hairdresser spends an entire afternoon mapping his head with comb and pins, training the handmaids who will later do the daily work. The styles shift with fashion. The imperial court is a weather vane for taste, but the goal is constant. Soften angles, lengthen the line, veil what the eye expects to see on a man. Heated irons lift and curve, oil smooths and tames, ribbons are threaded, ornaments wait in little boxes lined with wool. Cosmetics come next, and here the empire's logistics announce themselves. Powdered chalk, ground minerals, lampblack for the eyes, rouge pressed from roots and wax, unguents that blur pores and reflect lamplight flatteringly in evening halls. A painter's lesson disguised as grooming, highlight here, shadow there, a careful line that draws attention away from the remnants of what cannot be entirely changed. The instruction is practical: how to keep coal from running in heat, how to repair a smudge between courses, how to breathe while the veil is arranged. It is also theological. Learn the ritual, become the offering. Deportment tutors teach what bodies say when they move. How to sit so fabric falls like water. How to rise without disturbing the architecture of pins. How to take a cup without flaring the wrist like a soldier. How to tilt the head when someone of higher rank enters. These things seem small until you understand that courts are factories of small signs. Get them right, and you disappear into the role. Get them wrong, and you become the scene. Voice is the hardest. The throat is an instrument memory controls. Changing it is like convincing a river to run uphill. The tutor asks Sporus to hum at the edge of his range, to place sound forward, to let endings rise like questions. He teaches pauses and the politics of interruption. He offers phrases used by imperial women when they agree without conceding or decline without offering refusal. In every sentence hides the same lesson. You are here to keep a story intact. Clothing fittings begin when Sporus can stand long enough to tolerate them. Seamstresses arrive with muslin mock-ups first, then with garments cut from fabrics that remember their own weight. Stolas and pallas, layered so that they teach posture by gravity, are adjusted for a body that tailors are learning like a new terrain. Clasps are moved a finger's width, a belt is lowered to change the line. Linen underthings are stitched softer at the seams. The goal is not only to achieve a silhouette, but to build a daily exoskeleton that supports the performance hour after hour. Marcia, the seamstress who once dressed Poppia, handles a piece of fabric she recognizes from a gown the late empress wore in summer light, with a sheen that caught the afternoon. Her hands pause on it, and then continue. She has lived long enough at court to know the difference between memory and treason. She lifts the fabric to Sporus's shoulder and makes a chalk mark. When she steps back, she sees something she wishes she did not. If the light hits just so, the room will believe what it wants to believe. Around all of this swirl reminders that what is happening does not fit neatly inside the categories Rome says it honors. There are jurists who could argue, if they were allowed, about the status of such an act, who is protected from it, who is not, when and where it is forbidden. There are moralists who would condemn it in public and pay for it in private. There are senators who would feign shock in the morning and attend the wedding at night. The paradox is not a bug of empire, it is its method. The rule proclaims itself while power makes exceptions in the room next door. Through it all, Sporus learns the calendar that now moves him. Mornings for the regimen, oils, hair, voice. Afternoons for posture and conversation, and the art of being seen. Evenings for rehearsal. Walk the length of a hall with a veil that does not trip. Practice the grip for a hand joined in public ceremony. Practice the smile that says contentment without pride. He is being taught to do what Rome itself is doing, treat a performance as reality until reality yields. There are moments no one writes them down, but they are there when the room empties and the rehearsed breath leaves his chest and what remains is quiet. In that quiet, Sporus stands before a polished bronze mirror and watches a stranger learn to answer to a stolen name. The mirror is patient. It reflects without judgment. It also never forgets. When word finally goes out that the dressmakers may finish their stitching, and the jewelers may deliver their settings, and the musicians may rehearse under the frescoes, the palace settles into the hum that precedes spectacle. Invitations are not written. They are spoken in corridors by men with carefully blank faces. The temple calendar is consulted. An auspicious date is chosen, a festival season that will lend sanctity to what is, beneath all the silk, an act of domination dressed as love. The bride has a name now, and the city is about to learn it. The day chosen was one Rome already knew how to celebrate. Festivals haloed the calendar, piety warmed the streets, musicians had practiced the old progressions until their fingers could find them in the dark. But the palace had tuned these familiar notes to a purpose no book of augury had ever sanctioned. Lamps were lit along the colonnades until the marble seemed to breathe. Laurel-crowned doorposts. In the largest hall, fresh flowers and polished bronze reflected each other in a shimmering loop, life multiplied by craft. Guests arrived in the order that kept them safe. Senators ahead of knights, old allies before new petitioners, the merely curious pretending to be devout. Rome's weddings had a grammar, part religion, part theatre. A saffron veil, the flammeum, signalled the bride. Hands were joined in the dextrarum iunctio, a gesture older than any one house that said out loud, "These two will stand together before the city." A pronuba, ideally a woman married once and revered for it, was meant to guide the bride across the threshold. Bred from ancient grain, the farium of old aristocratic rites might be shared, because shared food ties people in ways words only claim to. In the imperial age, ceremony bent to rank. What mattered most was that Rome could recognize the shape of the union and so recognize the power that issued from it. Tonight, recognition was the point and the problem. The veil was fine, the gestures impeccable, the music chosen with a flattery so expert it sounded like tradition. But beneath the veil was a face that made every rite shiver. Sporus's steps were measured to the hem. His hair, coached for weeks, held its architecture through the heat. The cosmetics lay like a calm on the skin. Jewelers had found settings to echo the favorite pieces of the dead empress. Tailors had stitched silhouettes that taught the eye to obey the story. The pronuba, if named at all, was an invention of protocol, someone whose virtue could be borrowed rather than believed. The officiant's voice did not tremble when he spoke the phrases that sealed unions and empires alike. Rome had trained its officials for harder lines to cross. Nero took the joined hand as if performing a miracle he had ordered in advance. The hall understood its cue. A wave of applause, not too much to seem vulgar, not too little to risk offense. It is hard to clap for a wound, but people did. They smiled the way people smile when they are watched by men who decide salaries, borders, and the weather of a life. Gifts were brought: gold bowls, carved ivory, Mediterranean pearls. The lists were tallied by secretaries whose ink had grown used to the taste of impossibility. In a corner, musicians repeated a hymn until it fused with the hum of lamps and the soft thunder of sandals. No one mentioned the name that hovered like a scent over everything: Poppaea. The emperor took it in his mouth anyway and fed it to the room. After the rite, there was the long labor of appearing married. Sporus Sabina in the palace ledger was introduced to rooms that had been waiting for him, to servants already drilled in how to speak to an empress who was not an empress, to a daily schedule arranged to protect a fiction from the ordinary accidents of time. A litter was assigned for public movement, curtained and guarded. A staff was allocated: hairdressers, dressers, readers, attendants who understood how to make silence sound expensive. The treasury attached an income line to the roll. Petitions began to arrive because people petition whatever sits near power, and a roll this close is a sun, however it came to burn. The performance did not stop at doors. Banquets required the new empress to sit where a wife would sit, to incline the head when an ambassador spoke, to exchange a handful of scripted phrases with foreign envoys who stared just long enough to understand and then looked at their plates. State visits required the right degree of veil, the right weight of jewel. Processions through the city required an expression the crowd could read as serene. It is a strange thing to watch thousands decide to believe together. You can feel the decision move like wind. In private, the fiction thickened. Nero used the old name as if it were a magic key. He recalled memories and waited for answers that could not exist. He laughed at jokes told to another woman years before, and Sporus learned to laugh at the right place because safety wears many masks, and sometimes one of them is mirth. The emperor rehearsed a past that no longer belonged to the world, and the court, exquisitely trained, clapped as if art had been made. The palace became a hive in which every bee knew the scent of the queen, even if the queen had been invented. Why did no one stop this? Because empires are not only armies and marble, they are systems of incentives that make certain lies profitable to believe. Autocracy concentrates the power to harm in a single hand and outsources the management of that harm to people who dream of promotion. Courtiers learned long ago that complicity can be laundered as loyalty, that obedience can be phrased as piety, that the smoothest way to survive is to let your face be a mirror for a sovereign's wishes. If the emperor needed the world to accept a resurrection, the world, meaning thousands of people with mortgages on their futures, found the liturgy and sang. Patronage made it easy. The same logic that knotted freedmen to a patron by gratitude knotted senators, artists, priests, and informers to the emperor by access. Grain doles, contracts, commands in the legions, the right to build a temple or block a rival's road, all of that moved through hands trained to feel the weight of favors. You could object, in theory, to a marriage that was not a marriage. In practice, objecting meant losing the only currency that mattered. If you stood up too tall, someone would tap the purse that held your name. The law wobbled under the load. Rome's jurists loved categories: citizen and non-citizen, married and not, legitimate heir and bastard, man and unman. The case before them offered none of the comforts of clean lines. To adjudicate, someone would have to admit the premise. Better, then, to let the matter remain ceremonial, where performance can stand in for definition. Let the handclasp be binding because everyone says it is. Let the household staff and the palace guards and the treasury accounts do the work laws cannot do without staining themselves with text. Religion could be recruited too. If Poppaea had been honored like a goddess, then treating her return with a reverence bordering on cult was not blasphemy so much as coherence. Priests, who minded coherence as a baker minds yeast, found ways to bless the edges without touching the center. A new offering here, a festival seat there, an extra garland on a statue do enough small things and you can build a large answer. And the crowd? The crowd has its own logic. Most people did not see the wedding. Most people heard about it. Rumor writes its own scripture. Some scoffed in courtyards, then fell silent when a soldier passed. Some took the tale at face value because taking tales at face value is how you reach the end of a day in peace. Some were simply tired. Bread, games, a roof that didn't leak, a child who slept, that was the policy that mattered. If the emperor wanted a strange marriage, The baths would be no warmer if they argued. Sporus learned to live in the seam between spectacle and governance. He distributed small coins to petitioners on prescribed days because generosity is a costume, too. He appeared at the theatre because applause for the emperor must be an applause that looks shared. He practiced the sequence of gestures required at sacrifices, not because he believed the gods cared, but because men with knives and registers cared very much about the order of things. A life can be reduced to a choreography. A person can survive, sometimes, by becoming a dancer of perfect timing. But the hall where vows were spoken was not the only stage Nero desired. He had begun to treat the city as a theatre that could not appreciate genius. The stories he told himself required a larger audience, one trained from childhood to cheer for lyres and laurels, to crown winners of verse and voice and speed. Rome had clapped because it was commanded. Nero wanted clapping that felt like worship, so the emperor looked east, where festivals stitched the year into a tapestry of applause, and where the empress, Rome had learned to pretend to see, would be carried before foreign eyes that did not know which lies to tell. Ships slid out of Cenchrea and Lechaeum like pearls on a string, carrying musicians, actors, trainers, cooks, secretaries, a tame thunder of praetorians, and an empress the city of Rome had learned to see without saying the truth aloud. Greece promised something Rome could no longer give Nero: applause that sounded like love. In the festivals, crowns were not negotiated by senators but awarded by judges. Art, not armies, decided who stood in the center. If Rome had been a stage where power wore a costume, Greece was a stage where a costume tried to become power. The tour followed the holy circuit of games and theaters: Olympia, Delphi, Corinth, Nemea, and city after city that loved words and music the way soldiers love pattern in a shield wall. Nero entered contests for Cythera and song. He recited, he posed as charioteer. When rules got in the way, rules bent. Schedules were changed to fit imperial desire. Postponements were unspooled so that the emperor could gather more victories into a garland that could be weighed. He won even when he faltered. In one race, old writers say, he tumbled from the chariot and was crowned anyway. Crowns obeyed gravity. They fell toward the heaviest body in the room. The imperial box became a second throne, draped in fabric that drank lamplight. Sporus sat there, veiled and jeweled, the line of the jaw softened by art and instruction, the posture rehearsed until it felt like habit. Greek dignitaries, schooled in flattery, made their faces calm. Some had learned long ago that Rome's sovereignty could be soothed with honorifics. They called the emperor's voice golden, and his fingers blessed by the muses. They bowed to the empress with the gestures due to a consort. If they noticed the seam in the spectacle, they ignored it as sailors ignore a creek in good weather. There were moments when the theatre itself seemed to swallow the wrongness. Imagine the theatre of Dionysus in Athens, stone tiers warm with bodies. The Acropolis watching like an old god who knows every story ends the same. The emperor steps out in robes dyed deeper than wine. A hush moves like shadow over the crowd. He sings. The voice is competent and practiced, buoyed by the discipline that love of self can sometimes produce. When he finishes, the applause is quick and safe and large. Sporus inclines the head with a serenity learned in a room of mirrors. The scene is complete because the audience completes it, but a festival circuit cannot govern an empire. While wreaths collected around Nero's head, other garlands were twisting into nooses in the west. Provincial elites had tired of requisitions and spectacles that cost more than they soothed. The empire required attention, roads mended, commanders rotated, taxes counted with care, laws enforced by men who could recite them without trembling. In Gaul, Gaius Julius Vindex raised a standard against Nero. On the far side of the peninsula, Servius Sulpicius Galba began to step from governor to contender. In Africa, Clodius Mesa weighed his odds. The coin of the realm is attention. The emperor had spent his on applause. News travels at human speed, horse, ship, rumor, but there are currents that move faster than feet. Discontent in the Praetorian camp needed only a spark and a promise. Nymphidius Sabinus, wearing the prefect's authority like a borrowed cloak, offered the guard a donative sweeter than loyalty to a singer. The math was simple: fortune now, or fidelity to a man who might not be able to count to tomorrow. Rome's elite can smell the wind. They turned their coats slightly to see if the breeze would fill them. In Greece, the tour played on as if politics were a room whose door could be closed. Nero announced benefactions. At Corinth, he is said to have taken a golden spade to the earth as a symbolic beginning for cutting the isthmus, another theatre of will over stone. He also staged the grandest gesture of all, proclaiming the freedom of the Greeks at the Isthmian Games, echoing older Roman flirtations with Hellenic pride. It felt generous, and it cost little. Freedom proclaimed from a foreigner's mouth is not always the thing it names. But the channels between Athens and Rome are not long when your enemies sail them. Messages overtook the procession, Vindex in arms, Galba in motion, the guard uncertain, the Senate restless. An emperor who wants to be loved is vulnerable in a way, a tyrant who is content to be feared is not. Nero, sensing the wall move under his feet, turned back toward Italy with the speed of a man who needs to stand inside his capital to feel real. The return was not a triumph. At Naples, then up the coast, the reports grew colder. Friends gone absent, treasurers suddenly scrupulous, officers cautious in their greetings as if words themselves had acquired a tax. By the time he reached the city's edge, the wheel had already turned. The Senate, which prefers courage after the danger has passed, declared him an enemy of the state. The word hostis erases, favors faster than fire erases papyrus. The Praetorians, once a wall of swords, began to look like men in search of a new employer. Nero did what humans do when the story breaks. He tried to repair it with motion. Plans were thrown against the hours: appeal to the guard, appeal to the people, flee to the east and return with legions, stage a final performance that would force Rome to weep for the artist it refused to keep. Each scheme required hands he no longer controlled. The palace, so recently an orchestra of obedience, lost its conductor. Servants vanished into the folds of their own lives. Doors that once opened at his step suddenly remembered how to be doors. Through these dwindling halls moved the same small figure who had been taught to be a wife. Sporus followed as attendants gathered whatever could be carried in silence, jewels boxed in haste, a cloak thrown over a dress meant for rooms with better lighting. There were fewer bearers for the litter now, fewer soldiers at the corners of corridors, fewer eyes to learn the face that had been ordered into being. In the pocket of this collapse, the fiction still clung to its lines. The emperor addressed Sporus by the dead woman's name. The empress answered with the practiced dip of the head. Habit is not belief, but in emergencies it can pass for faith. The last scene belongs to a villa outside the city, a place owned by a freedman named Phaon, whose walls were more used to holding ordinary fear. There the emperor hid, flinching at every hoofbeat, composing speeches he would never deliver, asking aloud whether it is worse to be mocked after death or dragged before a crowd alive. The writers give us his final line artist's vanity masquerading as epitaph, and they give us the helper who steadied the blade when courage failed. They are less interested, as usual, in the quiet figure in the room, the one whose life had been shaped like a mask and worn until the straps cut skin. With Nero gone, the city needed to decide quickly what, and whom, it believed in next. Power does not like loose ends. Sporus was not a person to the men who counted. He was a symbol with legs, a story that could be paraded or punished. He would not be allowed to disappear into the crowd as a citizen does, because citizens are defined by rights, and he had been defined by someone else's grief. With Nero dead, Sporus should have been free, but power hates loose ends. Power abhors unguided symbols. In the days after Nero's suicide, Rome lurched through a season that later generations would simply call the Year of the Four Emperors. Names Galba, Otho, Vitellius, Vespasian rose and fell like banners in a storm. In that wind, Sporus was not a man. He was a portable story, and men who needed stories reached for him. The first to take him was Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian prefect who had helped dissolve Nero's last offenses and then, briefly, believed the guards' cheers might be enough to crown him. The prefect understood the grammar of spectacle. The quickest way to inherit the emotional residue of a reign is to inherit its props. Sporus, renamed and trained, fit the logic. Some accounts say Nymphidius even spoke of marrying him, a grotesque repetition intended to lace his own claim to the throne with the scent of imperial intimacy. It did not last. The guard can make emperors. It can also unmake them by lunchtime. Nymphidius died before he could finish the sentence he was trying to write with another person's body. Next came Otho, handsome, quick, and for a handful of weeks, emperor indeed. He had known Nero's court, had imitated it in miniature during his Iberian exile, and he could read the usefulness of a familiar silhouette. Sporus appeared again at dinners and receptions, the practiced tilt of the head restored, the voice trained to soft agreement, smoothing rooms where knives were tucked politely out of sight. In Otho's hands, the performance felt less like resurrection than like insulation, a layer of ritual protecting a fragile legitimacy. Otho's reign ended with a soldier's bleak mercy. He chose suicide over a civil war he believed would cost Italy more than his death would save. In the quiet that follows such decisions, courtiers count who is left. Sporus was still there, and the world still wanted him to stand for someone else. It was under Vitellius that Sporus' story approached its vicious coda. Vitellius loved spectacle with a gourmand's appetite, and Rome, bloodied by competing loyalties, had a population eager for distraction. The new emperor is said to have planned a public entertainment in which Sporus would be forced to play the victim in a mythic reenactment. Proserpina, dragged into the underworld, a script of violation and display whose cruelty would have been obvious to any onlooker and all the more profitable for it. Myth on the arena floor has always been an alibi for what the crowd wishes it could disown. It is only a story, they say, and cheer real pain anyway. Sporus declined the part the only way left to him. Ancient writers disagree about details. Poison is common in the telling, but they agree on the endpoint. He chose death rather than be made, once more, into a public object lesson in other men's power. He was perhaps 20. The palace had taught him to move, to smile, to answer to a name soldered to him by grief and violence. In the end, he answered to himself. There is a sorrow in that act that refuses ornament. And there is a clarity, too. Agency seized at the last edge of the stage is still agency. What does the twist reveal when we stop looking at the silk and look at the machine? It becomes plain that Nero's wedding was never about love. It was about control taught to an entire city. The jewels weren't adornments, they were rivets. The pronouncements of divinity weren't consolation, they were legal fictions hardened into habit. The court's complicity, perfumed, harmonized, paid on time, was not a series of isolated cowardices. It was the operating system of autocracy, in which people survive by keeping a story intact even when the story devours a human being standing in front of them. There is a temptation, when faced with a narrative like this, to let Nero's pathology fill the frame. He is indeed a central figure. His grief turned to ritual, his power to theatre, his desire to domination. But if we allow the emperor to own the whole scene, we miss the rest of the cast and the way their choices constructed the walls. The physicians who obeyed, the jurists who declined to define, the priests who blessed around the edges, the senators who applauded, the crowd that laughed, because laughter was the coin of safety. All of these hands hammered the fiction into something that outlived its maker and went on hurting the person it had trapped. Sporus disappears from the record the way the powerless often do, as a lesson others claim. The moralists of later generations like to use him to scold imperial decadence. He deserves better than to be a footnote in someone else's sermon. The right framing is smaller and more difficult. It asks us to imagine the mundane, daily courage required to survive inside a lie. It asks us to picture the quiet inventory of losses: name, voice, future, the possibility of being known without quotation marks. It asks us, finally, to sit with the cost of the sentence the palace wrote for him, "Be her," and the small, decisive word he wrote at the end, "No." History does not always let us hear the voice we most want. We do not know what Sporus dreamed as a child in the palace corridors. We do not know who he would have loved had he been allowed to grow into his own choices. We do not know if he had a favorite tune he hummed in rooms where silence had weight. We know enough to say his story is not an ornament on Nero's biography. It is a human life deformed by a system that needed applause more than truth. If you've listened this far, I want to hear from you. How should we tell stories like this? Stories where the sources are hostile or voyeuristic, where the facts come decorated with other people's agendas. What does dignity look like when we speak a name that history bent out of shape? Leave a comment with your thoughts. And if this careful way of looking at the past matters to you, subscribe and share this episode with someone who thinks power is only what shines. The shadows tell the rest.